So India is no longer a country of villages, like it is urban.
It's all about money. The money that you generate, can you use technology to generate it better?
There's garbage outside my house, no one's picked it up. The road is broken, or there's no water in the public toilet.
It could be a green space that needs development. The outcomes can be measured very easily.
We've been dabbling in broadly this area, which is known as civic tech.
But they have to follow regulatory restrictions. There are restrictions on how you can use CSR capital.
Who's your councillor? Where is the ward office? Who's my MP? Who's my MLA? What could a citizen do, for instance?
Hi, Shilpa and Krishnan. Thank you so much for joining us here for another episode of City Champions. Like we were speaking about a while back, I think the idea behind this series is for the audience to get one new insight about the urban development space with every single episode and one takeaway that they can act upon. So I'm going to go straight into the questions and then we'll take it from there. We're at a crossroads right now where urban spaces are growing faster than ever. And with that growth, there is, a multitude of problems that are coming up. Usually the people who are most affected by this are those that come from marginalized sections of society. So what I want to start this conversation with is about how can we develop cities to become more equitable, fair and sustainable. So I'll start with you, Shilpa. Given your vast experience in the investment ecosystem, what role do you think private capital, philanthropy and government initiatives can play to make sure that the development of our cities is sustainable and inclusive at the same time?
So I think one thing to keep in mind is that, look, in the end, cities are where people are coming for jobs, for employment, for income.
Yeah.
And they're coming in multitudes because it's a natural marketplace for people to find jobs. And it's really the government's role to therefore enable the infrastructure, the housing, the services, to allow people, not just earning livelihoods, but also to have a very quality life.
Yeah.
Obviously, just given the demand-supply gap, it's proving to be a very hard job for most governments in India. And I think at the end of it, it's really the government's role to provide bulk of this infrastructure and services. But I think there's very critical roles that private capital can play, philanthropy can play. And I also want to talk about CSR capital.
Yeah.
Because those are the three pools which are available to help the government in its two key jobs of, making policies and providing infrastructure. Let's start with private capital. I think private capital is really good at driving innovation, finding things which can, finding ways, products, services which can do it better, faster, easier, and cheaper. And I think that's really the role of private capital, really driving technology, number one. Number two is finding the demand supply gaps where government is struggling, but in a sustainable, profitable way, because that's the role of private capital.
Yeah.
Private capital can come in to fill that gap. So, natural kind of thing to talk about would be, say, affordable housing.
Yeah.
Is government makes enabling policies, really private capital can come in and provide, housing capital. And I can talk about some illustrations of that later. So that's the first role of private capital. Then if we look at philanthropy, I think philanthropy's role is really to come in when neither government is there nor private capital is there, but there's a need. And I think like that need can be, for example, what's more information, what's more data that's required by governments to make better decisions. And I'll give you a really beautiful example. So for example, we supported a WRI.
Yeah.
One of the things they did was really develop GIS tools to measure how a city can look at the heat map of the city, through GIS, or how it can look at the water flooding levels available, to the city governance authorities for them to make better decisions. If you don't have this information or data, you can't make better decisions about green spaces, about water management. But if you do, the question is who will pay for it? And that's the role of philanthropy. Filling those gaps to give better information to allow governments to make better decisions. I think the other role philanthropy can play is really to look at small pilots. Because, philanthropic capital in the end is the highest form of risk capital.
Yeah.
Right? So you can look at small pilots to see, okay, what can help? It can be small things like maybe going to an informal settlement and assessing, okay, how is it the best way to manage sanitation or water? It can be those kind of pilots. If successful, then the government can, of course, come in with its own significantly larger capital and mainstream that, make it available to everybody. But the third pool of capital, which I feel we should talk about, is CSR capital. Over the years, this kind of mandated capital has become quite a large player. But they have to follow regulatory restrictions. There are restrictions on how you can use CSR capital. And it's not as flexible as, let's say, philanthropic capital. But that doesn't mean it's not useful. And therefore, if you have programs or projects which are very clear in what they're seeking to achieve, and the outcomes can be measured very easily, you can go to CSR capital and get that in. And I think CSR capital is doing a wonderful job of stepping into things that could be as, simple as a historical monument that needs protection. It could be a green space that needs development. It could even be an educational or health project in the city, which makes, the life and quality of life for people much better. So I think there are different pools of capital and different ways in which all of them can be used.
Got it. I think we'll come back to, what is the state of available capital a little later in the conversation. And especially for people who are starting out in this space, how can they access all the three forms that you spoke of? But just moving to you, Krishnan, a little bit, Janaagraha's focus has always been on increasing citizen participation in urban governance, and inclusivity has to be a key part of it. So how can urban development at large become more inclusive? And if you can share some anecdotal insights from your work in the grassroots.
Thanks, Supriya. Shilpa spoke about such a broad variety of issues, and I just like to bring it all together from the perspective of the city, right? The city as a unit, as a place, right? As you rightly said, our cities are growing. They're expected to host about 800 million Indians by 2050. That's more than half of all Indians, right? So India is no longer a country of villages, really, right? Like it is urban. It's staring us in our face. And the city as an entity has a very difficult job. It has to do a balancing act between four aspects, which we call as the 4 E's, right? The first E is economy, right? We are still a low to middle income country. We need to, lift millions out of poverty. We need to give them jobs, livelihood. So and cities need to be the economic engine that powers India. So that's the first E. The second E is environmental sustainability. Our development should not come at the cost of environmental degradation, right? Again, look at how pervasive air pollution, heat waves, flooding are in Indian cities. So we need to nurture both the natural and the built environment alongside economic development. So that's the second thing to balance. The third is equity. Already there are significant deficits in housing, in municipal services, in urban infrastructure. And unfortunately, the effect is most for the women and urban poor, really. Like disproportionately, they are affected when some of these don't really happen well. So the third sort of balancing act really is on equity. And the fourth one, which I'll call it as almost a circle, it circumscribes everything else, is that of civic engagement, right? Because most solutions for solutions to be truly contextual and to survive, right, to survive the test of time and for it to be adopted truly, it needs to emerge from through this process of civic engagement, come from the community, from the citizens. So really it's such a tough job really to balance these 4 E's, and therefore the question that you asked is very pertinent, which is, in fact, you just married the last two, right? How do we do participative and inclusive urban development? There are no easy answers. I can maybe outline 3 possible pathways or 3 possible tools that we have at our disposal to try to do that as a society, right? The first is that of urban planning and design. Shilpa spoke about affordable housing. Can we ensure that there is sufficient affordable housing, near the places of work, especially for the urban poor? If not, can we ensure adequate connectivity. Right, that's one. The second is how do we design roads, and public spaces which are women friendly, which are urban poor friendly. What does that mean? Roads need to be built not just for cars and motorbikes, but also for pedestrians and for and for cycles, which is predominantly what the lower sections of society actually use. So how do you design roads? How do you design public spaces? How can we provide parks and playgrounds for for children to play near low income communities? So all of these are sort of this one tool of urban planning and design can really enable equitable development. That's one tool that we have at our disposal. The second tool that I'll talk about is that of participatory governance, right? Where again there are two parts to it. One is that how do you give more power to the local government? How do we ensure adequate representation of women and the urban poor in both city administration, as employees of the city, and as elected representatives, right? About half of all councillors in India are women, right? That's a fantastic opportunity. So how do we empower, how do we equip them to drive this multi-sectoral impact, right? That we believe, we are very, very confident about that as a channel for driving positive change. These are councillors are very, very grassroots. They know their constituents really well. It's not like an MLA who has a really large area. It's a very small ward. So how do you really drive change through this councillors? How can we get councillors to own their own development, of their place, right? So that's the second tool. The second part of the second tool I would also say is actually platforms for citizens themselves to participate, right? And the slightly higher income sections, we call it as residence welfare association. But what can be equivalent? So for instance, the government of Odisha, we've helped them set up slum dwellers associations. So all 3,000 slums in urban Odisha have now formed these associations, which are now equipped to sort of manage their own business, right? And a lot of these slums have been upgraded where they are no longer called as even slums, right? Like it's about dignity and all of that, right? Like, so how do you do in situ upgradation, which means that there's no redevelopment, but given where they are, how do you provide a basket of urban infrastructure and services in a very inclusive, participatory way, where the community, the Slum Dwellers Association elect office bearers. The office bearers therefore take charge of what needs to happen in that area, right? So that's the second sort of a tool. The third tool that we have at our disposal is money, right? So Shilpa also spoke about that very well. How do we ensure that when we are budgeting, that all of these aspects are considered? How do you ensure that there is enough funding available for women-friendly cities, for urban poor-friendly cities, and so on? So that's, I'm just scratching the surface, but it's a fantastic topic to delve deeper into.
Got it. And, you spoke about multiple things, but one of the things that I just want to stress on is access, right? And because of the advancement of technology now, even for public participation, there is more access. So how do you think technology can be leveraged for citizens to hold people more accountable, but also participate in improving our cities?
Yeah, we are big believers. In the power of technology, and we've been dabbling in broadly this area, which is known as civic tech.
Yeah.
Right. Like most people will know, fit tech and gov tech and all of that. So this is tech, like, which is basically technology, tools, and platforms as and data. Right. We shouldn't, so the tool is just, it's a tool. What's actually in the tool is really the data. So how do you use technology, tools, data, and platforms to connect what we see as three constituents or three different groups of people in a city? There are the citizens, there is the city administration, those who actually run and govern the city, and then there are the elected representatives, right? So there are use cases that technology provides for each of these three groups. So imagine a platform which connects these three stakeholders in a seamless way. What could a citizen do, for instance? A citizen, the obvious thing is you could lodge a complaint on a civic issue.
Yeah.
Right? There's garbage outside my house, no one's picked it up, or the road is broken, or there's no water in the public toilet, right? So that's the base. But then they could also get information about their councillor. Who's your councillor? Where is the ward office? Who's my MP? Who's my MLA? Right? That's the second category. They get information about services. How do I get a license? How do I register my child's birth? How do I pay my taxes? How do I register a property? Right. So there's that, and then citizens could also actually provide feedback on services, saying, "Aaj maane aaya kya 24 hours?" Right. Like things like that. Right. Like you can actually use that app to indicate that where the services as that I am eligible to, where they delivered today. Right. So that's the citizen interface of a platform. Right. Now come to the city administration. Obviously, if citizens only complain and nothing is done, then citizens get disengaged. So then this is the other side. How can the city administration access these complaints and grievances? How can they integrate it into their existing mechanisms and workflows? How can they connect it to their call center, for instance? Imagine you get a call from the city administration saying, I got your complaint and this is now resolved. I'm just calling you to thank you for your service to the city, right? So that's a use case for the city administration. They could also do much more, right? Like they could get information on the status of some of these infrastructure, right? Like if citizen is sort of saying like, are public toilets working, for instance, right? Or is the playground, is the equipment rusted, right? That when children are getting hurt. So this critical information, to actually take, data-based decisions on where to invest can actually be available to the city administration. And now look at how the loop completes with the elected representatives. The elected representatives will see how many complaints were raised, how many were resolved, where do I need to intervene? How do I hold the city administration accountable, right? But then they can also do much more. They can call for meetings. They're like, I am going to be in this ward, this area of the city, right? Whoever wishes to meet me can come and do so. There's a government scheme or an incentive that a citizen is eligible to access. They can do that. There's an immunization campaign you can announce on the app. So imagine one seamless app, which is, so a version of this is what we built called I Change My City. Okay. And there's also an app that we built for the ministry as part of the Swachh Bharat mission in urban. The app is called Swachhata app. So but the broad concept is really this, right? Where it covers all of what you said. There is awareness for all three parties. There is agency of the citizens. It encourages the citizen to become an active citizen, really, right? Like take ownership of change, right? There is basically there is actionability, which is more for the city administration. I have data on the basis of which to take action, right? And then there is finally accountability, building mutual trust and accountability. So we are again big believers to sort of end where I started, and these are just again some examples of how technology could transform the interface between citizens and our cities.
Got it. Shilpa, I mean, we all know you are also a believer in the same sort of philosophy. But over, your work with ONI, what are some interesting civic tech use cases that you saw come through? So any examples of...
Yeah. So, Krishnan talked a lot about the governance and how citizen engagement can really, with technology, be transformed. And I think that's certainly true, because if you take any problem which is like you're dealing with many to many or one to many, digital technology is a way that can really, help. But maybe I can also touch upon technology's role in the administration side for urban local bodies. And as important as it is for citizen engagement and the whole participation process, it's equally important for this large, kind of player, the urban local body, which is really governing cities. I think the first thing is really, it's all about money. So, the money that you generate, can you use technology to generate it better? The money that then you're going to spend, can you keep track of that much better? And I think the role of technology there has been, immense. Let me talk about two illustrations that, we're quite closely associated with. So the eGov foundations, they actually have, I would almost call it like a SAP system for urban local bodies, which had been in a sense incubated and started there, now is available in a more, I think widely available form, through the government. And that can really help urban local bodies to track their finances. Just a simple thing like keeping track of how monies are collected, monies are spent, and then to report that. So I think that's like the first kind of thing. The other illustration I can talk about is, for example, a property. Property is the biggest revenue source for cities.
Yeah.
And therefore, how you kind of track your properties in the city and how you collect property taxes is one of the most fundamental ways for cities to generate revenue. And there are companies which, offer this service. So a company we had supported called Transfer used to really do this. Map properties across the city, and cities could, contract with them to, in a sense, keep track of it. But I think from those days, even to today, I mean, the other day I was, in conversation with the municipal commissioner of Pimpri and Chinchwad, and he said that he had actually instituted digital ways of tracking and collecting property tax in Pimpri Chinchwad, and he had seen like a 30% growth in taxation generation straight away. So I think, the second is using technology to really improve the revenue flows of the city itself. So I think those are two important things. The third is really the governance of the city. And, the thing I spoke about earlier, for example, having geospatial maps which help you understand better how the city is responding to very basic climatic things like heat, rain, water. These are like very fundamental tools which are available to city planners to take better decisions about the city. So, like if you think about technology across the whole spectrum, whether it's for their own administration, whether it's for providing services, or even for, in a sense, actually the connecting with citizens and redressing citizen grievances, I think technology is just everywhere and can be a great support and just be a great tool really for everyone.
Got it. I'm going to start from you again because, you started the conversation speaking about money, and that's, of course, an important part for everything. So let's just dive a little deeper into financing. And what do you see are gaps today that exist in funding in the urban development space? And do you think that there's enough government budgeting or private sector interest here?
So in the end, I mean, one must just look at, the urban local body. Let's think of it as a corporation. And for any corporation to really succeed, what does it need? It needs to know it has sufficient funds to plan for the future and sufficient funds to manage its day-to-day. If you look at, our urban local bodies, actually, their ability to generate their own revenues is significantly short of what they need to spend. And that's, I think, the most fundamental problem that urban local bodies face. And then because, when you go out to the market for money, you also have to have a certain credit standing for which you need to be able to say, okay, here are the details about my balance sheet. This is how my profit and loss account or revenue account looks. And that's when you can access market. So let's talk about both things separately. I think the first is, can ULBs really do many things to really increase their own sources of revenue? I know Janaagraha and, even the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs have worked quite closely on city finance. And if you look at City Finance, which is a portal which really talks about cities and their funding, you'll see that a lot of cities really struggle to improve this very important aspect of revenue, which is their property taxes. So I think the first is really to get that improved. That's number one. Number two, when you come to where can they borrow from? I think there's good news in two forms. The first is that Indian capital markets are really deep, both equity markets and debt markets. So if you can prove to the market that you're a creditable borrower, you can actually access these markets quite easily and not be strapped for any future projects that you want to take. So the question is, what can you do? What can you do to give this conviction to markets? Right? And I think for that, it's really about being able to show your balance sheet, audited balance sheets to the market. So first is build your creditworthiness through better references, then to communicate that. So I think these are the two, aspects of really going into the Indian capital markets. There's a third, which maybe we should just touch upon and pick up if there's time, is really, climate and cities are going to be very big kind of topics of conversation. And there's a huge pool of capital available on climate. So what is it that cities can do to access this? The fact of the matter is, while we talk about trillions of dollars available in global climate finance, if you talk to any municipal commissioner, he'll say, I've not seen a penny.
Yeah.
And it's true, because probably to access money like that, you need to build your projects in a certain way. You need to be able to measure outcomes in a certain way that the agencies responsible for disbursing this money feel confident to give that money. So I think there's an immense opportunity to really build projects in the city, which look at not just climate mitigation, which is about carbon emissions, but also about, climate adaptation, So to think of new ways of managing the, in a sense, progress and environment balance. How do we change the way we do things? How do we improve our own carbon footprint to begin with? And to build these better projects, to measure these better and access the immense amount of global climate finance that's available. So I think that's an opportunity which we should also think about.
Got it. Krishnan, just want to cue in on your views on this. And, what are some innovative approaches cities can adopt to ensure that they have the financial resources that they need to meet the growing demands of urbanization? And especially like from your perspective, given your work, if you have any anecdotal examples of projects that you've been a part of where you've seen access to finance come through, what did it take, that entire process? Yeah.
So firstly, just want to endorse everything that Shilpa said. And it's not a coincidence, by the way, that we have collaborated with them to do a lot of this work on improving municipal finances broadly. If I could just start by quantifying the gap, right? And this is from a World Bank sort of a report. It said that from about 2021 to 2036, a 15-year period, you need about $840 billion for financing our urban infrastructure and municipal services at the projected urbanization rates, which comes to about $108 per capita per year. Contrasting that with how much we have spent in the preceding decade, that's about $26 per capita per year. So we are actually spending about a fourth of what is needed, right? So that's really the extent of the gap, and hence, this stresses the importance of everything that Shilpa spoke about the need to access external sources of funding, right, and to also boost your own revenues, right. Now, in that, on the own revenues side, basically, how do they get own source revenues, right? Like the easiest thing to do for cities is property tax, where we've been working for the last 5 years. So I'll give you an example of an initiative that helped boost property tax collections, right? So the Finance Commission basically is a constitutional body that sets the rules of the game on how the nationally available funding gets split to states, and then further to urban local bodies and rural local bodies and so on. So basically, it sets the rules, and the rules are in place for every 5 years. So that's a great opportunity for us to influence what do we get states to do or what do we get cities to do. So the past Finance Commission, which was the 15th Finance Commission, we were able to work with them and say that, listen, a lot of the funding that you get, it is contingent on if you are able to make your audited balance sheets available publicly. Right? That is a mechanism to do what Shilpa spoke about, the idea. Hence, the idea of city finance was born. Right? So suddenly, every city is interested and willing to, upload their finances transparently. Transparency is useful for the markets, but also from the citizen participation. Like the citizen knows, what my city is spending on and how much. Today, out of the 4,900 cities in India, 4,200 plus have uploaded their audited financial statements transparently for any Indian citizen to view, and it's a strong signal to the market. That's fun. Then second thing that we were able to do with the Finance Commission is to say that for the bigger cities, I will give you your money. The smaller cities don't even collect much property tax.
Yeah.
Like, and when I say smaller cities, think of cities of less than 50,000 and small tier 2, tier 3 in the common parlance, right? But the bigger cities can be actually link the funding that we give them to reforms that they do in property tax. What can you do? How can you increase your property tax collections? You can do two things. One is I cover my base. I increase my base that I cover, right? That right now, say I'm only covering so many people. Right. There are many other people who own properties who are not part of my base. How do you start covering them also? So that's one. The second is you can do things to increase your collection efficiency, which means that I know I need to collect it, but I am not able to collect it, right? So it will forever show up as receivables in a city's balance sheet because you're never able to collect it. So how can you increase the collection efficiency, right? So these are sort of two categories of reforms that the city finance and the 15th Finance Commission incentivized cities to do. So from the 4-5 year period from 2018 to 2022, property tax collections in India have increased by 43% as a result of some of these reforms, right? The transparency and the conditionality of the transfers. So these are some sort of concrete mechanisms to sort of improve your own source revenues. There's a third piece which on sort of not just borrowings, but how do you attract even private investment? So that's something which is still very, very nascent, right? So if you look at India's story of how we built our national infrastructure, highways, ports, airports, right, from the 90s, early 2000s, it is by attracting private investment. It was all done on a PPP basis, right? A lot of highways, were built by the private sector, ports, airports, right? They're built, owned, operated, right? In fact, the technical term they use is DBFOT, design, build, finance, operate, transfer, which means that private sector does all of the above. So suddenly the gap that I told you, between $26 and $108 per capita per year, you have mechanisms to bridge this. So can we begin looking at some of these mechanisms to potentially finance our urban infrastructure? The city anyway needs to do what it does. It needs to publish its balance sheet. It needs to, clean up its act a little bit. It needs to attract, borrowings. But can we also look at attracting private investments to build some of these? Could be another way to bridge this thing.
Got it. Shilpa, just, closing the loop on what Krishnan said, like he spoke about PPP, right? So how can we foster more effective collaboration between private sector and the public sector to bridge some of these gaps and overall also mitigate some of the challenges that we've spoken of?
Private sector can bring in two things. They can bring in technology, they can bring in execution focus, and they can also bring in money. So, that's all that they can bring to the table. I think the example he gave was a great one, which is that as India has developed, a lot of things private sector has come in, taken the lead, delivered, and then built out for the nation a lot of its assets. And we talked about roads and airports. All of them are very successful examples of what has happened. I think at a smaller level, if you look at cities, I think we're beginning to see pilots. So let's go all the way from, big airports and cities into something like fecal sludge management. Okay, now that seems like a really hard and difficult problem to solve.
Yeah.
But what the government has been doing is actually looking at opportunities to get private sector to engage in this whole process of waste collection, waste disposal, to do it in a very, I would say institutionalized and commercial manner, and to actually generate employment also a little bit more formally. I think there are experiments in this which have been tried. I know, for example, in Orissa, this is something that has begun to work well. So I think not just in terms of large infrastructure, but also in terms of, getting into more operating level kind of arrangements, I think public and private can play a role in coming together.
Got it. We've spoken a lot about, financing for cities, and we've gone through relevant examples of how projects also have happened across the board. But what about young people? What about change makers? What about startups that are looking at venturing into the urban development space? We spoke about, access to capital that's available for climate at large. But again, going back to what you started with the 3 or 4 different forms of capital that's available, right? And stressing a little bit more on CSR and philanthropy. How can startups access this pool of capital? And given that you have so much experience in this space, what are some of the golden rules or tips that you can give to them to be able to access this effectively?
Yeah. So let's talk about, the for-profit startup community first and young change makers there. I think first the good news. The good news is that, a lot of private capital, like venture capital, has come in to support startups of all, sectors, right? I mean, we've seen financial inclusion, we've seen, mobility, education. There have been like so many great examples of what has happened. At the same time, when you look at civic tech, so let's talk about, civic tech and young entrepreneurs in that space, it has seemed like that's been off to a slower start. And I think if I look at, really the crux of it, I think 2 words come to my mind. One is the ability to scale, and the second is the ability to build sustainable revenue models. I think that's really the 2 critical things. Let's talk about scale. I think if you operate in the area of civic tech, for sure, you need to work in collaboration with the government to get scale, because otherwise you're not really going to get there. And therefore, how do you build your networks? How do you build your community of partnerships with different, government bodies becomes the question. And that's really an important one. The second is, how do you become financially sustainable? And it's possible that you might get a lot of scale, but you might not take the sustainability box because it's really hard to, generate revenue out of such contracts. Not that it can't be done, but you have to figure out ways to do it. And maybe if we look at, a couple of kind of ways to do that, I mean, sometimes people find it easier to align with, let's say, larger contractors or vendors who have established mechanisms of working with the government and to become maybe a service provider to them. That's one way to get started. Another way is to say, look, the problem I'm solving is critical enough, and therefore for early capital that's required, to turn to philanthropy and see if there is some form of concessional capital or even service contracts or grants that's available. So that's a second way of generating revenue. That's number 2. Number 3 will then be actually to diversify revenue sources. And I do recall a young entrepreneur we met who was very good at robotic engineering. And he had developed a very interesting product for city sewerage, like to clean the pipes, what you always hear about are such difficult jobs and dangerous jobs. He had developed a robot which can do that. Very useful. But again, if you kind of focused only on that, the sustainability was, a question to be solved. And therefore, he diversified his products into other areas to enable revenue diversification. So I think a combination of all these 3 things is important. I want to also take a minute to talk about, non-profit change makers, because I think they're equally important, if not, I would say really key drivers of the entire engagement process in a city. And I think the good news there is I'm seeing a lot of very smart talent get into this area. So I think, first of all, there's a great amount of talent that needs to be backed. The second is, I think philanthropic and CSR capital is increasingly, conscious of the need to back such entrepreneurs, because for the city as a whole, and to talk about, the whole ambition of not just, big and large cities, but inclusive cities, equitable cities, and cities that care for every single person, I think the role of such change makers is also important. So I think for both, really, there is capital available. it boils down to being able to show that you can scale and that you can build things sustainable.
And in terms of philanthropy, have you seen that grow over the years? Especially because, say like venture philanthropy is something that people have started speaking about, but hasn't usually been the norm. And of course, you're a part of ACT and they do support certain for-profits and there are people associated with that. But have you seen a capital increase from philanthropists in the urban development space?
I think we have to look at urban also sometimes as a horizontal. And within that, you will have kind of sectoral division. It could be education, it could be skilling. So I think I see a lot of capital that naturally flows into what people see are easier to measure outcomes, right? I mean, it's easier to say how many children have you skilled, how many women have you, supported for health outcomes. I think what I'd like to see a little more of is things that are actually go beyond such sharp outcomes, but maybe into building, greater, I would say infrastructure. It's not a very good word, but greater social infrastructure to support a lot of this also. So what I'm trying to say is not just outcomes based, but maybe a little bit beyond that. I think there we could, look for a little bit more philanthropic capital to flow in. And I think we'll get there.
Perfect. As we come to the last segment of this conversation, I think one of the things that I would really want to deep dive into is your respective careers. And, to decide to work in this space, especially, I mean, for you, it's been a while, but your switch has happened recently. But for how did you first decide to take up the career that you did? And what made you sort of evolve into making a career out of what you do today?
So, for about the first few years of my career, I would say that I was in an autopilot mode, right? Like, I think most of us are, I guess, right? Like, you sort of go to college, you get a job, right? Like, you go where the flow takes you. But at some point of time, at least for me, about 3 or 4 years into my first job, I was in a corporate banking job at that time. Right, on the surface of it was all great. I was living in Bombay and then Hyderabad. It was all nice places to sort of make a career. I was making good money. Right, but at some point there was a feeling that is this really what I want to do with my life? There was no sense of fulfillment. Right, and that was what kind of prompted a little bit of introspection, saying, what do I really want to do with my life? So this is about, a little over a decade, almost 12 years ago. So when I decided that, I needed to at least try it out, and I recognized that I could try it out because I had the economic and social luxury to experiment, right? So my experiment was that I joined the Teach for India Fellowship. I taught for 2 years in a government school, which was actually not too far from where I grew up, right, in Chennai. It was, it was a government corporation school. I taught grades 4 and 5, right? Like 45 really bright young people, many of whom are actually now in college, by the way. So that's gratifying to see that journey. But that really was then the spark that said, listen, there are a lot of problems, right? Like India is fundamentally an inequitable society, right? And due to an accident of fate, I was where I was, but there was still a lot that needed to be done. Wherever you looked, there were sort of so many problems. So it was this vague idea of, how can you work for a better India? As vague as that sort of led me down this path. And then around that time is when, Shilpa spoke about it briefly, the sector was beginning to mature. I think maybe even 7-8 years before that, like when I just got out of college, I don't think these were even considered as legitimate career options. There wasn't an ecosystem of organizations which could sort of, which you could join. There, the concept of an NGO was more like, Jholawala, like Gav Chalo, right? Like that was but that's not it, right? That's not the nonprofit sector in India at all today, right? It's very professional, right? There are significant opportunities, right? And And it's not like there's a huge sacrifice that you make around. So really, I continued in that journey. After the fellowship, I continued in education. I was with an organization called Central Square Foundation, in Delhi for a long time, which really cemented, my understanding and awareness of how to drive large scale change. Right, that there are two roles of non-profits. Right, like one is, of course, you work at the grassroots and try to sort of help communities there and fill in gaps in service delivery. But the other part of the role was what I was keen on, which is how can we act as catalysts, because ultimately the large change can only be got either by government or by the private sector. Right, the non-profit is more of a catalyst or a change agent. So really that was my interest. So I joined Central Square Foundation, where I was driving school education outcomes at scale, working with the central government, working with mini state governments, influencing policies, helping the government design and implement better programs, really, where you're not doing it yourself. Really, the work is done by the government. That's how it should be, because they're spending a lot. So the challenge is more, how do you increase the effectiveness of what they do anyway?
Yeah.
Right. So that was really my journey. And about a little over a year ago was when I realized, I also need to explore other pathways. Right. Education was one. And as I said, towards this big goal of a better India. Right. And that led me to Janaagraha. I've always lived in cities.
Yeah.
Many of the problems that we talk about, right, like which are actually symptoms of much of the issues that we've spoken about, right, like it's very apparent to me, traffic jams and sewage and air pollution. In fact, air pollution was a major reason why I chose to relocate my family out of Delhi.
Yeah.
Right. So the problems were obvious, and Janaagraha was again very attractive, where you're using the tools of system change, of catalytic philanthropy, to try and bring a large scale change. So really, for sort of many young people, the point that I will repeat is that the sector, the broader the impact sector in India is growing. Right, it needs a lot of talent. Money is beginning to come in, both domestically through CSRs and from foreign foundations, and there are significant opportunities. It is a very professional sort of a track, and it's not easy, right? Like,
Yeah.
I mean, for those who may say it's an easier career path, it's not. How can changing India, be easy? It's not, right? So it's a tough job, but a very, very fulfilling career path, if I may say so.
It's really interesting how you spoke of the Teach for India fellowship, because that continues to be that one fellowship that so many people who want to get into, not-for-profits today, or even any kind of impact organizations. If I was to look at Jewish as well, I think most of the people who are working in curriculum or any kind of skill development initiative that we run are Teach for India fellows. So I think an interesting way could also be to develop more such fellowships which are aspirational, which become like a training ground for people to go through to enter this space. What about you, Shilpa? And just even from an investing point of view, right? Like, honestly, when I first came across what you do, and even at ONI, and I saw cities as one of the thematic areas of investment. I was really intrigued. So I just want to learn a little bit more about your career decisions, but also investing in cities. How did that become a focus for you?
So the first, I did the what do I say, the usual role.
Yeah.
Much of my life, I spent 30 years in BFSI. I used to lead the treasury for ICICI Bank and then the investment bank. After I did that for 30 years, I realized one of the things I really enjoyed was the ability to, contribute to conversations that had policy outcomes, which could really change things for the better. And to me, that was such a powerful kind of thought that, if you bring the right inputs into a conversation, it can actually result in an outcome which makes things better for many people at a very large scale.
Yeah.
And therefore, at my current job, where we do a mixture of things, we look at a certain area of work and we try and support it in a 360 way, which is really either through non-profit funding or through for-profit work, or even in generation of things like research. So whatever it is that is required for a problem or a challenge, you kind of look to invest and support people who have a very broad vision to take something forward in those spaces. I mean, that's really what I do now. Why urban? I think when you look at, the two like really big kind of things that are affecting our lives.
Yeah.
One is that clearly there's a big move for people into urban spaces. And like urban, let's talk about urban not just as the big metros, but even the smaller towns and cities which are growing in the country. And therefore, if we really want to focus on a better India, like Krishnan said, it's also about making sure that the quality of life and livelihood in these new kind of towns, cities and metros is commensurate and is actually offering that life for every single person. And what we realized is that it is not an easy problem, right? I mean, it is because there are so many different aspects of it which make it hard. First is like people are coming into a city probably where they don't belong, right? I mean, even I didn't grow up in Mumbai. I'm a resident of Mumbai now. So most of us, we become residents of a city which is not our natural place of belonging.
Yeah.
But we make the city ours and the city makes us belong. And how do you then translate this, kind of sense of belonging into a much better place? It's a central question, difficult question, and therefore we thought one worthy of really leaning into.
Awesome. Thank you so much for this. I think, every conversation that we have as a part of the series is a learning ground for me. And one of the most interesting takeaways that I'm going back with today is looking at cities as balance sheets and P&Ls. I think that's something that, when you're thinking about some of the problems that are around you, you never think about how infrastructure really works, how money is moved and how everything is recorded. So thank you for being here and for sharing all of this with us today. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks.
Perfect.